I've been sort of slacking on making this, but I finished The Wire for the second time all the way through a couple of weeks ago. And The Wire has always been, I think, generally accepted to be like one of like the two or the three great shows of like that first golden age of television, the 2000s, along with Sopranos and Breaking Bad, let's say. It shares a lot of similarities with The Sopranos in that it basically seems to be intentionally or not, The Sopranos for sure intentionally, The Wire maybe less so, is sort of like a farewell to a bygone era. Sopranos with like that surge of Italian American culture and gangster movies, to The Wire being sort of a goodbye to like that uh what a cop show was like and what the cops were like for maybe up to a century. And a very, very interesting kind of intersection in The Wire is technology changing the game and how the cops interact with essentially what is like this huge surge in like essentially like hip hop and street culture in the US from like the 90s through the 2000s. And to see how seductive people find the show, case in point, how little people like season 2, I think is because a lot of the cool criminals that they were into because everyone loves gangsters in the first season, I think it was jarring for people to completely have that put away. Maybe the show was trying to be like layers of Baltimore, but even if you like season 2, which I do think that they seem to have reacted to the reaction to it a lot because it's almost the only season that kind of works in a bubble. The rest of it is layers and layers and layers, and you build more aspects to the story. Whereas the second season, they almost kind of like dropped it because it was like too hot or something. And it does to some degree figure into the later seasons, but I think you can almost see in how much of it is isolated from the rest of the show that I think they changed course a little bit for the more subsequent seasons. Obviously, there's always like a sophomore curse a little bit, so maybe the pivot wasn't exactly what they thought it would be. The two or three main things from The Wire that really, really stick with me as being like absolutely great aspects of it. These two are somewhat related. The performances are like outstanding across the board. I think it's very funny that McNulty and Stringer Bell, who for the first three seasons are like arguably the two biggest characters, are both British. That's very funny. McNulty, you don't really hear the accent too much, except when he's very, very emotional speaking to Kima when she's in the hospital. That's the only time I really heard it. Um, it really started to underline to me when in season 4 you have a lot of the junior high kids as actors in it, that it seemed like the kids were very comfortable and had a very good environment to do very, very like nuanced excellent roles. This is particularly like Naaman and Michael. I do think that like there's something really like special about the work environment. And something that relates to this is that I don't think you see this as much in shows now, but even for a show that's ostensibly very mature and quite like a crime drama with a lot of dark elements to it, this is a show that essentially has like, especially in the law enforcement scenes, like a non-stop sense of like wit and humor and levity. I think shows kind of choose one lane now and either like serious LARPing or just trying to be like a surrealist comedy to some degree, usually without much success. But something I really enjoyed about this was just like the nonstop sort of humor and like warmth to a lot of the scenes as they go through it. It suffuses all of the dialogue, and this is, I think, in many ways true to like what classic Hollywood and like what classic American entertainment is like. That ultimately you have to have a good time doing it, and the story and plot means a little bit less than like the feeling that you have when you're watching it. Think of like, I don't know, Howard Hawks movies in the 40s, or like just basically what a lot of like classic genre work was like. Um, I have very few criticisms of the show. I This is more of a choice than I think a mistake, but it feels like this is especially true of Lieutenant Daniels. But it seems like no one can have a scene that's a domestic scene with their partner or whomever that doesn't just immediately turn to being about work and their work life. This is kind of like Michael Mann or something like that, in that you can almost see that for some people, like the way they're depicted, because this is a professional show by means of like it's about their work life, that everything is shone through that filter and they're entirely defined by it. But I do think it's a missed opportunity to some degree how much of like the scenes at home are still scenes where people talk about their jobs. And maybe that is true for a lot of people, but it is, I think, somewhat of a missed opportunity. The first time I watched the show, I found it to be like the most compulsively watchable show I've ever seen. It was almost impossible to turn it down between episodes. This time, too, the same criticism I had the first time, I still believe I have this time, in that I do think the ending is overly fond and a bit too sentimental. Uh, it's basically like, yes, all these elements are corrupt, and the city is like essentially like to some degree like a dark and unforgiving place. But I think the cops get off pretty easy. This to me feels like part and parcel of like David Simon and whoever else having like all this time of unfettered access to the police in Baltimore and wherever else to make homicide life in the street in this show. And it might just be his attitude, it might just be the tone of it, but it's a little soft in how kind of well off everyone ends, who are the principal characters. That's a bit strange to me. Um, I also largely think that there are so many seductive moments with Omar and Marlowe, and basically most of that side of it, that sometimes it strikes me a bit odd that the show is I don't know how to say this properly, but sometimes it also struck me a little bit odd that, well, at one level you have a show about like the multifaceted layers to a city and how they interact, and on the other end of it you're kind of making up a cops and robber story. Like, okay, so Chris is going to do this, and then he's going to go talk to Marlowe, and they're going to have this clever way. And so that blending of fiction and a kind of analytical nonfiction at some points just feels like a little arbitrary, but I think I'm being a little. I don't think it's a fair take, honestly, because you have to have a show that's enduring and diverting and interesting, and it very much does that. Because I don't know what like the demographics of the writing group are, but something that's really been messing with me in 2025 and 2026, at the beginning of 2026, watching the show, was that like this show came out over 20 years ago and ended just under 20 years ago, and a lot of phrases and slang that people say even now, like young people, like 16 to 25 say now, are phrases that you will hear in this show. And that is crazy to me. Sometimes it's like they're so in tune to like weirdo Baltimore music, which is different than a lot of the rest of this, a lot of the rest of the country. Like there's some mainstream hip hop that you hear like some Ludacris and Jay-Z, etc., but there's also some weirdo stuff. But it's so interesting to see how long it takes, like a full generation, for a lot of like pretty niche street slang to become something that's like quite popular in American culture. That was crazy to me. There's not too many other things I really need to tap on. There's a lot of characters. Like there's a scene where Kima says goodbye to the moon and the stars, the hoppers and the hustlers near the end of it, which I just love so much. I thought was beautiful. Um, I love the extremely corpulent sergeant in the homicide department. I love Bunk Moreland, and I don't think I'm the only one to love Bunk Moreland. Bunk Moreland has sort of like what I call Wendell Stamp syndrome. If you know, you know, where sometimes a character is not that critical to the story, but they get so much time and kind of take over to some degree because I think the like creators of it like them so much. And then when you see that Wendell Pierce, I believe his name is, became like the principal lead in David Simon's next show, you're like, okay, I think I could probably make a educated guess about who liked this guy so much. And just basically in closing, I do think that there's, as useless of an analysis as is, I do think this is like probably consistently like the best five season series ever made. The level of like intelligence, warmth with actors, the like granular street level use of a city where it's not just a backdrop but a living breathing part of it, and a comfort with actors across the board from so many different age levels and backgrounds is startlingly good. And there's like a warmth and a wry kind of laconic masculinity to this, which is just incredible to watch. I was surprised by how much like my girlfriend liked this show. She is kind of like in the law field, but I thought this would be more of like a ooh, kind of like gross man, like kind of like gross, disgusting detectives and like just crime. But it worked a lot better than I thought, just because like I don't know, I just think like the it's very real and very approachable in a lot of ways. This isn't necessarily a fantasy show at very many elements. And overall, I'm more impressed with it on a second watch than I was in the first. And I do think this is like maybe the all time great if you're hoping for something grown up, which is hard to find.